3 months in at a restaurant you both like. He says he's gonna get better at texting back. You believe him. And underneath the believing, quieter than a thought, something in you settles. Not relief exactly, more like walking into a dark room and finding the light switch exactly where your hand expected it to be. You've been here before, not with him, with someone whose name you don't say out loud much anymore. Different face, same weather. Your friend noticed before you did. They always do. Around week 5, they said something careful. The way people do when they're trying not to be right too loudly. He kind of reminds me of the last one. And you said no, and you meant it. Because the differences were obvious. Different job, different jokes, different way of standing in a kitchen. You had evidence. 6 months later, you're having a version of a conversation you have already had twice with 2 other people in 2 other apartments. And the strange part isn't that it's happening again. The strange part is how little of it surprises you. So the question arrives the way it always does, usually late, usually alone. Why do I keep attracting the same kind of person? It's worth slowing down on that word, attracting. It puts you in the passenger seat as if you're standing still, giving off some signal you can't hear. And the same type of person keeps walking toward it. Something about you brings them in. Something about you needs fixing before the next one arrives. But the moment people examine when they ask this question is almost always the wrong moment. You think the choice happened when you met. It didn't. Meeting is mostly accident. You met at a wedding or through roommate or because the app put 2 faces in front of you at 11 at night. The real choice came later and it was much smaller and you probably don't remember making it. Week 4, he cancels something that mattered to you and gives a reason that doesn't quite cover it. There is a pause. You feel the pause, and then you do something so fast, it barely registers as thinking. You explain it for him. He's stressed. Work is hard right now. It's not a big deal. And you'd rather not be the kind of person who makes it one. That's the selection, not who you were drawn to, who you were willing to stay for after the first piece of information arrived. Here's what makes that moment so hard to catch. It doesn't feel like a decision. It feels like ease. There is a well-documented tendency in how people respond to things they've encountered before. Repeated exposure to something neutral tends to make it feel more likable and, more importantly, easier to process. The mind handles the familiar with less effort, and that lack of effort gets experienced as something pleasant. We usually don't notice the fluency. We notice the pleasantness. And we assume it's coming from the thing itself. Most of this research was done with simple stimuli. Shapes, words, faces, sounds. Extending it to how a person chooses a partner is an interpretation, not a proven law. But it points at something a lot of people recognize from the inside. Familiar doesn't announce itself as familiar. It announces itself as right. There is a second body of work people usually reach for here, and it deserves more care than it normally gets. Researchers studying attachment have found that the patterns we develop for relating to people close to us tend to show some continuity over time and can shape what we expect from later relationships. Tend to, some. The evidence supports a real influence, not a sentence handed down at age 4. Plenty of people's patterns change. An attachment style is a description of a tendency, not a diagnosis. And definitely not an explanation you can staple onto every disappointment you've ever had. So set aside the childhood for a moment. It's not always the interesting part. The interesting part is that this whole system is useful. Reading a person quickly, deciding within a few weeks whether you can relax around them, knowing what a certain tone of voice means before they finish the sentence. That's not a malfunction. That's how anyone gets close to anyone. Intimacy requires shortcuts. Nobody could build a relationship if every gesture had to be interpreted from scratch. The trouble is that the shortcut doesn't check what it's matching against. It matches against what you've already lived. If the version of closeness you know best came with a low hum of uncertainty, then a person who makes you a little uncertain is going to feel more like closeness than a person who doesn't. Not because you want to suffer, because your equipment for recognizing love was calibrated on the love that was actually available to you. The calm ones feel like nothing. You've probably said that out loud. There was no spark, which brings up something less comfortable. Ask yourself when you first noticed the pattern. Almost nobody notices it while it's happening. The pattern appears afterward in the retelling, usually to a friend. Usually after the third one ends, that's when the three separate people become a type. Memory doesn't hold a relationship as a full record. It holds a version, and that version gets built and rebuilt every time you tell it, shaped by how the story turned out. Once you have a category called the kind of person I always end up with, the earlier ones get quietly filed into it. The ways they were different fade. The one trait they shared moves to the front. This doesn't mean the pattern is imaginary. It probably isn't, but some of its sharpness may be something you made after the fact. And the sharpness is what makes it feel like fate. There is a further version of this that most people would rather skip. If a pattern repeats across 3 relationships with 3 different people, the constant in it is you. Not as blame, not as a flaw to be located and removed, as a role. You might be very good at a particular part, the patient one, the one who doesn't make it a big deal, the one who can be counted on to hold the situation together while the other person figures themselves out. That role only works with a certain kind of co-star. And a person who's absorbing your patience will feel at first like someone who needs you, which feels a great deal like being wanted. You didn't attract a type. You know one part very well, and you keep casting for someone who can play opposite it. That's the part the internet usually gets wrong. Attracting is passive, and it lets the whole thing be a mystery about your energy. The alternative is worse because it's small and specific, and it happens on a Tuesday in a text thread when you decide not to say the thing you noticed. The apps didn't create this, they did make it faster. When the choices are nearly endless, most people don't slow down and choose more carefully. They lean harder on the instant red because there is no other way to get through 100 faces. And the instant red is exactly the equipment that's already been calibrated. More options, same filter, running quicker. Whether that ends up mattering as much as it seems to is still an open question, and anyone telling you they know the answer is guessing. Something is worth sitting with here. If that immediate pull toward a person is partly built out of what's already happened to you, then it isn't reliable evidence about them. It's information about you. Chemistry might be less a signal about the future than an echo of the past that's learned to sound like a promise, which doesn't mean you should distrust it. It means it's data, not a verdict. And if you've decided that a certain type is your fate, that decision has a way of arranging things. The nervous, unfamiliar person you met last spring, who was steady and a bit boring and didn't make your stomach drop. You didn't reject them. Nothing that dramatic happened. You just didn't feel much, so you didn't follow up. And the story stayed intact. So go back to the restaurant. He says he'll get better at texting back. You believe him. And your hand finds the switch in the dark, and you feel the small, comfortable click of a room you already know the shape of. The question isn't whether he's like the others. He might be, he might not. The question is what you'd do if he weren't. If someone showed up who didn't fit the outline you've been carrying, and there was no click and no drop in your stomach and no sense of arriving somewhere you'd been before, you'd feel almost nothing, and you'd probably call it nothing and go home.